Okay, let's unpack this. You've brought us a truly fascinating and, well, frankly, pretty intense collection of materials today.
Mm-hmm.
They give a very specific, very unfiltered view of India. So our mission here in this deep dive is clear. We want to meticulously go through these, pull out the core arguments,
Right.
and really help you, our listener, understand these significant points being made about India's contemporary landscape.
Indeed. And the documents, the articles we're looking at, they paint a vivid picture. It's in many ways quite a critical portrayal.
Yeah, you can say that again.
They lay out some really strong claims. We're talking political dynamics, pretty significant social tensions, and how India is seen globally.
Okay.
So we'll be carefully exploring how one particular perspective frames, say, the treatment of a large minority population.
And Muslim population specifically.
That's a big focus, yes. But also the alleged influence of media narratives, India's international standing, those complex relationships with its neighbors, and some deeply challenging internal issues as well.
Right. So be prepared, because the sources we're digging into, they really unfold a detailed and often, well, critical narrative. Our goal is just to help you navigate these points
Exactly. To grasp the scope of what's being claimed.
and connect the dots, hopefully without getting overwhelmed by just the sheer amount of detail here. And this is where it gets really interesting right from the start, with a foundational point they establish very early on.
Yeah, what's striking immediately is the sheer scale we're talking about, the population group at the heart of so much of this discussion. The sources consistently state India is home to about 200 million Muslims.
200 million.
Yeah. I mean, just think about that number. It means Muslims make up roughly 14% of India's huge population. That's one of the largest Muslim populations anywhere in the world.
Wow. Hi.
But despite those numbers, the sources emphatically describe them as being treated like, well, the phrase used as second-class citizens.
Okay, so that's a very strong claim right off the bat.
It is. And it's not presented as like a casual observation. It's framed as a fundamental premise that this significant minority, larger than many countries, is allegedly facing systemic challenges within, the world's biggest democracy.
The implications of that, if true, are huge.
Profound, yeah. It could impact social cohesion, the economy, political stability on a massive scale. It sets up this deep tension right away. A huge, vital community reportedly feeling alienated, disempowered in their own country.
And that claim, it really sets the stage, doesn't it, for understanding the more specific incidents the sources detail, especially around the current political climate.
Precisely. And this isn't just a broad demographic statement. The sources immediately connect this alleged marginalization to the current political scene.
Okay.
They directly link what they describe as systematic persecution to the tenure of the ruling party, the BJP, under Prime Minister Modi.
Right.
The sources claim it's an environment where it's basically, quote, open season on Muslims. And they don't just say that. They try to back it up with specific data points.
Well, okay, like...
Well, they present these as evidence of a concerning pattern, maybe an accelerating one. For instance, there's the India Hate Lab report from 2023. It's cited as documenting 668 hate speech incidents specifically targeting Muslims in that 1 year.
668.
In 1 year.
Yeah. The sources highlight that this averages out to 2 incidents a day.
2 a day?
Ah.
Wow. That's relentless, if accurate. That's the picture they paint. A pervasive barrage of hostile rhetoric. And they add that over a third of these incidents explicitly called for violence against Muslims.
Straight up calls for violence.
That's what the sources claim, yeah. So this data, as they present it, is meant to illustrate a really distressing trend. It suggests hostility isn't just there, but maybe actively increasing.
And does it stop there, or do they suggest this pattern continues?
Well, the sources seem to suggest it intensifies. They point to posts from Twitter from 2025.
Okay, more recent data then, supposedly.
According to them, yes. Claiming 1,460 Muslims were targeted in 419 separate incidents in just 1 year of what the sources refer to as Modi's third term.
Okay, so the numbers are going up, according to this data.
That's the narrative presented. These numbers are meant to show a pervasive pattern, not just, isolated events. They strongly suggest a deliberate increasing issue.
Trying to draw a direct line between the BJP's time in power and this reported surge.
Exactly. The picture painted is one of escalating intensity. An environment where, according to these sources, hostility towards Muslims isn't just tolerated, but maybe part of a deeply concerning agenda.
The sheer volume they're citing,
Yeah.
it definitely underscores the urgency they're trying to convey, like a continuous campaign.
Right. And the claims get even more severe. They move beyond hate speech and isolated incidents to something the sources assert is nothing short of ethnic cleansing in slow motion.
Whoa, okay, that's a very heavy term, ethnic cleansing.
Extremely heavy. And they emphasize this isn't just about like abstract borders or political talk. It's described as a systematic process targeting a specific religious group within India.
Do they give examples?
Yeah.
Because that's a huge accusation.
They do. They provide specific and frankly quite harrowing examples to illustrate this. In Assam, for instance,
Okay.
the BJP chief minister there, Himanta Sarma, is explicitly named. The sources allege he is deporting Muslims at gunpoint.
At a gunpoint.
That's the claim. And the accusation is these individuals are being labeled illegal Bangladeshis, even if, the sources say, they are actually Indian citizens.
So stripping them of citizenship and deporting them by force.
That's the allegation. The sources go on to state that hundreds are reportedly missing, and activists are sounding alarms. It paints a picture of a distressing human rights crisis unfolding.
Hundreds missing. That's terrifying.
The detailing of these alleged actions is meant to show a targeted, coercive strategy.
And is this just Assam, or do they claim it's happening elsewhere?
Well, what's striking is how they expand on this. They claim similar actions elsewhere to highlight a pattern. They also cite Gujarat, which is Modi's home state,
Right.
where 250 Muslims were reportedly, again, rounded up as illegals.
So it's a similar pattern alleged in different places.
That's what the sources use this repetition for, to connect these administrative actions to that broader claim of systemic persecution. And yes, that slow-motion ethnic cleansing idea.
The language they use, at gunpoint, hundreds missing. It's clearly meant to convey severity.
Absolutely. It paints a very stark picture of vulnerability, of oppression. And if these allegations hold water, it raises profound questions about legal rights, human rights, and why critics, as cited, might use a term like ethnic cleansing.
It shifts the narrative from isolated incidents to potentially a coordinated strategy impacting lives, citizenship, existence itself.
Exactly. So what does this all mean for the specific policies and political strategies the sources claim are being used? Let's connect this to the bigger picture of how they claim power is being maintained and what they call the ruling party's playbook.
That's crucial. If these patterns are happening, how do they show up in actual laws and political strategies today?
Well, the sources state very directly that the BJP's strategy, as they see it, is to demonize Muslims to keep power.
Okay, a blunt assessment.
Very. And they point to specific legislative measures they claim are key to this strategy, particularly anti-conversion laws.
Right, I've heard about those. They're in several states now.
12 states, according to these materials, and they're described by the sources as criminalizing interfaith love.
Criminalizing love.
Crucially, the sources explicitly link these laws to that highly controversial love jihad narrative.
Ah, yes. The conspiracy theory about Muslim men marrying Hindu women to convert them.
Exactly. The sources frame it as a baseless conspiracy theory, used primarily to target Muslim men who marry Hindu women. They assert this narrative serves as the pretext for these laws, which they see as discriminatory.
So the laws are based on this conspiracy theory, according to the sources.
That's the argument presented, and they try to back this up with a specific data point from 2020,
Okay.
asserting that 14 out of 17 cases filed under these anti-conversion laws reportedly went after Muslims.
14 out of 17. That's
Yeah.
hugely disproportionate, if accurate.
That's the point they're making. Trying to illustrate a highly skewed application of these laws against one community, reinforcing the argument that the primary intent is, allegedly, to target Muslims.
And they mention any political figures specifically on this?
They do. They include a very direct, very impactful quote attributed to Yogi Adityanath. He's a prominent BJP figure, chief minister of Uttar Pradesh.
Right. What did he supposedly say?
He's quoted as having straight up said Hindu and Muslim cultures can't coexist.
Can't coexist. That's incredibly divisive.
According to the sources, yeah. Not subtle. A clear declaration of ideological division, further reinforcing their argument about the BJP's alleged agenda to demonize Muslims and create a religiously segregated society.
So statements like that, policies like these, the sources are saying they institutionalize the discrimination, making love jihad a legal reality for some.
That's the depiction, with potentially severe personal consequences for those caught up in it. And these policy discussions, as presented, They don't happen in a vacuum. The sources ground them in a vivid historical context of communal violence.
Right. They bring up past events.
Yes. They reference past incidents of large-scale violence, presenting them not as isolated blips, but as recurring patterns of alleged persecution.
Like what specifically?
The most prominent example cited is the 2002 Gujarat riots.
Ah, yes. That was horrific.
The sources claim up to 2,000 Muslims were slaughtered, and they notably describe this as reportedly happening under Modi's watch.
Implying alleged oversight or inaction from him as chief minister back then?
That's the implication drawn in these materials, using this historical tragedy to establish a precedent for large-scale communal violence with alleged political dimensions.
And is it just Gujarat 2002? Or more recent examples too?
It's not limited to distant events. They also mention the more recent 2020 Delhi riots,
Okay.
stating 40 Muslims were killed then. So these historical events, as depicted in the sources, serve to paint this picture of ongoing, significant communal violence.
With this alleged pattern of political oversight, inaction, or maybe even complicity, as they frame it.
Right. And that raises the question, how do these past events, as presented, feed into or justify the current legislative and political landscape, especially controversial laws like the Citizenship Amendment Act?
Ah, the CAA, yeah.
The sources use these historical examples to bolster their argument that the current challenges aren't isolated, but part of a larger ongoing narrative of communal conflict and alleged targeting, creating, they suggest, a climate of fear and insecurity.
That makes sense as a connection they draw.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act. The sources describe it how?
They report it as being called straight-up Islamophobic by its critics.
Okay, why? What's the specific issue they raise?
The controversy, as the sources explain it, comes from the law reportedly favoring non-Muslims for Indian citizenship, specifically those who migrated from certain neighboring countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan,
Okay.
while explicitly excluding Muslims who migrated under similar circumstances from those same countries.
Ah, I see. So it creates a religious test for citizenship, essentially, excluding one group.
That's the core of the criticism presented. This differential treatment is seen as reinforcing that narrative of systemic discrimination against Muslims, further marginalizing them, effectively creating different classes of citizenship based on religion.
And what about outside India? Do the sources mention any international reaction?
They do, and it's significant. They explicitly state that the United Nations is cited as a critic of the CAA.
The UN itself.
If that citation is accurate, yes. Which provides a powerful kind of external validation to the concerns raised internally about the law's potentially discriminatory nature.
Yeah, UN criticism carries weight.
Absolutely. This global scrutiny, as presented, underscores the seriousness with which these policies are viewed beyond India's borders, and it contributes to that broader argument of systemic discrimination within India.
Which leads to another question, right? How do policies like this, combined with maybe a decline in political representation for Muslims, make that feeling of being second class worse?
That's a key connection the sources make. It's like a compounding effect, legislation and political structures potentially working together to disempower a significant group.
And do the sources talk about that decline in political representation? Is that something they highlight?
Yes, they do. It's presented as a significant and worrying trend. They point to specific data points to illustrate a diminishing voice for Muslims in India's top political circles.
For example?
Well, they explicitly state there are no Muslim ministers in Modi's 2024 cabinet.
Not at all. In the entire cabinet.
That's the claim, which, given India's substantial Muslim population, is presented as a really stark indicator of their alleged political marginalization.
That is striking. Any other data points on representation?
Yes. Connecting to the broader picture, they also emphasize that the number of Muslim members of parliament in the Lok Sabha, that's the lower house, the direct voice of the people.
Right.
That number has reportedly dropped from 30 to 24 since 2009.
So a noticeable downward trend over the last decade and a half or so.
Exactly. And this trend, as highlighted, isn't just a statistic. It's linked to that broader argument of systemic marginalization and disempowerment.
Because if you don't have representation,
it can significantly limit your community's avenues for raising grievances, for advocating for policy changes. It can worsen that feeling of being sidelined, treated as second-class citizens, as the sources imply.
concerns might go unheard, needs ignored in policy.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
So the systemic pressure, as depicted, isn't just about policy anymore, but about active disempowerment within the democratic system itself,
Yeah.
affecting their ability to influence things or seek justice through normal channels.
Which is particularly concerning given how large the Muslim population is.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here is how the sources then describe the information ecosystem, the media landscape, that they say both shapes and amplifies these issues. It suggests the problems goes beyond policy into like the very fabric of public discourse.
Right. The media's role. So the sources claim this pressure isn't just policy, it's actively shaped, amplified by media, which they call, what was the term?
They use a controversial term, Gaudy media.
Gaudy media. Okay, what does that mean, according to them?
It's a strong accusation. They describe news channels as essentially licking Modi's boots, actively pushing what the sources describe as deliberate falsehoods.
Okay, so accusing media of being completely biased and pushing propaganda.
That's the assertion. And they give a specific, pretty jarring example, the Corona jihad narrative.
Ah, I remember hearing about that. The idea that Muslims were deliberately spreading COVID.
Exactly. That narrative, as presented here, exemplifies how false information can be weaponized, used to incite hatred, demonize a whole community, especially during a vulnerable time like a pandemic. The sources aim to show a deliberate misinformation strategy.
Do they name specific outlets?
They do, which is interesting. They name outlets like Opindia and Swaraja,
Yeah.
claiming they are churning out propaganda painting Muslims as terrorists or invaders. This detailed accusation aims to show it's not just general bias, but a targeted, perhaps organized effort to disseminate negative, harmful portrayals.
Wow. So the concept of Gaudy media, as they presented, is a media landscape that's not just compliant, but actively used for political agendas.
That's the picture painted.
Yep.
Allegedly creating an environment ripe for misinformation, communal division, legitimizing prejudice.
Which raises the question, how does a media environment like that, if it exists, influence public perception, impact society, trust in institutions?
It suggests, according to these sources, a kind of deliberate manufacturing of consent for discriminatory practices.
And it's not just traditional media, right? The sources mention online platforms.
Oh, yeah, massively. They claim online platforms are amplifying this divisive content, describing social media like WhatsApp, X, and TikTok as being drowning in hate.
Drowning in hate. Strong words. Do they have anything to back that up beyond anecdotes?
They actually cite survey data to illustrate the reach and effectiveness of this digital stuff. A 2020 survey is mentioned specifically.
What did it find?
It stated that 56% of Muslims saw digital conspiracies claiming they're taking over India.
56%. Half the community seeing these conspiracies online. That's huge.
It's a significant figure, yeah.
Yeah.
Suggesting a pervasive sense within the Muslim community of being targeted by false, insidious narratives, fostering an environment of suspicion, of fear.
Do they give specific examples of how this works online?
They recount a very specific illustrative anecdote from the pandemic,
Okay.
describing a viral TikTok clip of what they term an individual calling the virus Allah's punishment, which allegedly fueled the fire of that Corona jihad narrative. And while the person involved was reportedly arrested, the sources emphasized that the lie spread faster than the truth.
Yeah, that often happens online. Misinformation spreads like wildfire.
Exactly. This vivid example illustrates, as presented here, how easily misinformation, especially emotional stuff tapping into biases, can spread virally, how it profoundly impacts perceptions.
Showing how these online echo chambers contribute directly to that broader demonization narrative makes it hard for truth to catch up.
Definitely. And it raises another question. How does this rapid, often unchecked spread of charged info online create such a volatile environment, potentially eclipsing efforts to counter it, leading to real-world prejudice, maybe even violence?
And who's driving a lot of this online content, according to the sources? Do they identify any specific groups?
They introduce another specific term, and back.
And balked, meaning?
They label them blind Modi worshippers, described as foot soldiers actively flooding platforms like X with what the source called garbage.
Okay. And what kind of garbage are we talking about? Examples.
They give examples like posts asserting Muslims are Pakistan's spies.
Ah, the classic disloyalty trope. Casting suspicion, demonizing by association with an adversary.
Precisely. It illustrates the nature of the online attack, as described.
And what's the overall takeaway from this and balked phenomenon, according to the sources?
Well, the concluding point they make is pretty stark. They state, it's not just hate, it's a machine tearing India apart.
A machine. Wow.
Yeah, underscoring the perceived scale and allegedly organized nature of this online activity, portraying it as a significant systemic force actively contributing to a deeply divisive environment in India.
So connecting the dots. This pervasive social media behavior, as described, actively contributes to the unraveling of social cohesion, of trust.
That's the suggestion, that the digital world isn't just reflecting tensions, it's an active battleground for narratives impacting the very foundations of society.
And this intense internal conflict, as described,
Mhm.
it must affect how India is viewed globally, right? What does this mean for India's reputation?
That's a critical point the sources make. Given these internal dynamics, they state unequivocally that India is catching global heat,
Okay.
with some international assessments even going so far as to describe its situation as among the worst in terms of democratic backslide.
The worst. That's a strong claim. Do they back that up?
They try to. They point to specific assessments from, reputable international democracy watchdog organizations,
Right.
which lends weight to their argument.
Like who?
Well, they cite prominent ones like VDEM and Freedom House, both widely recognized for assessing democratic health, civil liberties worldwide.
Right. And what did their reports say, according to these sources?
Their 2025 reports are referenced, reportedly calling India an electoral autocracy.
Electoral autocracy. What does that mean exactly?
According to VDEM's definition, it suggests a decline where elections might still happen, but fundamental democratic principles, civil liberties, judicial independence, media freedom are reportedly eroding significantly.
Okay. And Freedom House?
They reportedly labeled India partly free, which also implies significant challenges to political rights and civil liberties, a regression from full democratic freedoms.
So these labels, electoral autocracy, partly free, they're significant.
Hugely significant, yeah. These assessments, as presented in the sources, contribute substantially to that negative global perception they describe, raising big questions about India's democratic path, its commitment to pluralism, human rights.
And labels from groups like VDEM and Freedom House carry real diplomatic and reputational weight.
Absolutely. And these international assessments, according to the sources, are directly linked to a broader internal decay within India.
How so?
They assert that democracy is rotting under Modi due to what they claim are constitutional institutions gutted, media muzzled, and hate crimes ignored.
Strong words again. Gutted institutions, muzzled media, ignored hate crimes. Do they give examples of the hate crimes being ignored?
Yes. A particularly vivid and disturbing example cited is the issue of cow vigilantism.
Ah, yes. Attacks related to protecting cows, often targeting minorities.
Exactly. The sources state that 1 in 5 Hindu-on-Muslim attacks from 2019 to 2024 were reportedly tied to such actions by cow vigilantes.
1 in 5, that's a high proportion.
And here's the really grave claim. They add that these acts occur with BJP's blessing.
With the ruling party's blessing. That implies direct political endorsement or at least tacit approval for violence.
That's the extremely serious allegation made in these materials.
And is this getting international attention?
What's deeply concerning, as the sources frame it, is that, yes, it is. They reference extensive international media coverage. Outlets like Al Jazeera, The Guardian, The New York Times.
Major global outlets.
Mentioned as reporting on Muslims being hounded, homes demolished, lives ruined. This aims to show these severe internal issues aren't just isolated, they're getting widespread global visibility and condemnation.
And does this affect only Muslims, according to the sources?
No, and this is important. The sources explicitly broaden the scope. They state, and it's not just Muslims, Dalits, Christians, Sikhs, all get screwed in this majoritarian nightmare.
So suggesting a widespread impact, undermining minority rights generally.
That's the picture painted. A declining democratic and inclusive society where various minority rights are systematically undermined. If you connect the dots, these examples, the international reports, they paint a critical picture of India's internal state, its human rights record, suggesting a profound shift away from its secular foundations as the sources see it.
Which brings us to maybe more generalized criticisms, stereotypes India reportedly faces globally. Sometimes from these issues, sometimes from other perceptions.
Exactly. That's a crucial pivot, because the sources discuss a very specific, very derogatory term, the Pajit slur.
Ugh. Yeah, I've unfortunately seen that online. It's disgusting.
Absolutely toxic. They explain it originated on 4chan's Toxic Corners, used to mock Indians with racist stereotypes, hygiene, tech scams, overpopulation.
Just awful racist stuff.
Totally. Now, the sources acknowledge it's offensive, but then they make a really controversial claim about why it sticks.
Okay. What's the claim?
They assert it's because India's got real issues,
Mhm.
trying to draw this link between the slur's persistence and perceived internal problems. It's,
Uh,
yeah, a complex and uncomfortable argument they're
Yeah.
presenting.
So they're trying to connect this racist slur to actual societal issues they identify. That seems fraught.
It is, and what's thought-provoking is how they then attempt this connection. They cite examples of what they call a lacking civic sense.
Like what?
Behaviors like spitting on streets, littering, chaotic traffic. It's a stereotype for a reason, the sources argue.
Okay, so they're pointing to observable behaviors and saying that's what the racist stereotype latches onto.
That seems to be the argument. While it's absolutely vital to condemn the racist slur itself, the sources are trying to say that external perceptions, however prejudiced, sometimes latch on to perceived internal realities.
It raises a really difficult question, doesn't it? How societal behaviors, as depicted here, can unfortunately be exploited by prejudiced people to fuel negative, unfair stereotypes globally, even if based on isolated things or exaggeration.
Exactly, a sort of painful introspection on how internal challenges might in some ways be leveraged by those with bad intent to perpetuate harmful generalizations.
And it's not just general stereotypes. The sources also detail specific experiences reportedly faced by foreigners in India, contributing to its global image.
Yes, they claim foreigners often face harassment too, stares, catcalls, or worse.
Okay. Do they mention specific data on safety?
They do mention a 2019 report flagging India for high sexual violence with 30,000 plus cases yearly. But, and this is crucial nuance they add,
Yes.
they state that these stats get twisted to paint India as a hellhole.
Okay. So acknowledging the problem, but also how data can be misused or exaggerated to create a purely negative picture. That's complex.
It is. It highlights that tension between actual reported incidents and how statistics can be selectively used.
And other perceptions contributing to the image.
They mention things like theft in hotels being sometimes overblown, but stories of scams or stolen wallets don't help. Suggesting even exaggerated claims or isolated incidents can add to a damaging narrative about safety, trustworthiness.
And social media's role again.
Pointed out again, yeah, citing ex-posts amplifying negative experiences, foreigners venting about no civic sense or creepy vibes.
But they offer a clarification.
Yes, an important one. They state it's not everyone, but it's enough to fuel the hate.
Okay. So acknowledging the issues aren't universal, but significant enough in impact to contribute to the negative global narrative, potentially overshadowing positive aspects.
That's the implication. These points present a complex challenge. Real issues intersecting with pervasive negative perceptions, sometimes exaggerated, often fueled online, creating a particular global image India has to deal with.
Which brings us to a really crucial point of balance that the sources themselves present. Despite this whole list of criticism challenges, they do acknowledge some progress.
Yes, absolutely. And it's important they do. They specifically mention that India's literacy is up to 74% and that poverty is down to under 20%.
Those are undeniably significant developmental gains. Literacy up, poverty down, huge improvements for millions.
Absolutely. Tangible progress in key social economic areas. Any nation would celebrate those.
But there's a but, isn't there? What's the tension the source is present?
Well, right after acknowledging these positive points, they follow up by stating that the chaos overshadows the wins.
Okay. So despite real progress, the negative stuff, the challenges, the perceptions we've discussed, they dominate the narrative.
That's the crucial admission from the sources. That despite tangible gains, the negative perceptions, the internal challenges, are so prominent, so impactful, that they unfortunately seem to dominate the overall story about India globally, according to these materials.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Assessing a place like India.
Yeah.
Huge progress alongside huge challenges, and the challenges often shape the perception more strongly.
Exactly. A nation's story is rarely simple, often a battleground of competing narratives. And these complexities, internal affairs, global perceptions, they spill over into India's relationships with its neighbors, too. What's fascinating here is how history and power dynamics seem to constantly shape those interactions.
Indeed. The sources directly ask that question. Why do neighbors hate India? And they attribute it to, what was it?
Two main factors, according to them, history and flexing.
History and flexing. Okay, let's start with history.
They immediately point to a foundational event, the 1947 partition.
Right. The division of British India into India and Pakistan.
Which, they state, left bad blood with Pakistan, making their rivalry obvious. This huge historical trauma, as presented, clearly continues to shape relations today, fostering deep mistrust, animosity.
And they connect this to current issues.
Yes, they provide a specific quote attributed to a Pakistani leader, Bilawal Bhutto, mentioned for calling out India's Muslim demonization.
Ah, so internal Indian issues, like the alleged treatment of Muslims, become points of contention with Pakistan, fueling the rivalry.
Exactly. It becomes a tool in diplomatic exchanges, exacerbating those historical tensions.
And does this extend beyond Pakistan? What about other neighbors?
Well, what's fascinating is how the sources do expand on this. Bangladesh, for instance.
Okay, what are the issues there, according to the sources?
Reportedly, Bangladesh gripes over water disputes like the Teesta River. That's a specific, long-standing resource-sharing issue that's strained relations.
Right, water sharing is often contentious between neighbors.
But the sources also introduce a newer grievance, those Assam deportations we discussed earlier.
Ah, the alleged deportations of Muslims labeled illegal Bangladeshis.
Exactly. Those alleged actions are now cited as another significant point of contention between India and Bangladesh. Naturally, that creates deep concern and resentment in Dhaka.
Yeah, you can see how that would directly impact relations with Bangladesh, internal policies having immediate external effects.
Precisely. Showing how deeply intertwined internal policies and historical issues are with cross-border relationships, especially with a direct neighbor sharing a complex history and a long border.
And what about other neighbors? Sri Lanka, Nepal.
The sources don't stop there. They report concerns from Sri Lanka and Nepal too, stating these nations resent India's Big Brother vibe.
A Big Brother vibe, meaning India is seen as too dominant, too interfering.
That's the implication. They provide specific examples to illustrate this perceived interference, mentioning India meddling in Nepal's 2015 constitution or its alleged involvement in Sri Lanka's politics. So this Big Brother vibe, as presented, suggests India's size, its economic power, its regional influence, instead of being seen as helpful cooperation.
It's seen as heavy-handedness, interference in their internal affairs.
That's a perception described, leading to resentment, mistrust among smaller neighbors.
So how do the sources sum up these regional dynamics, the power imbalance?
Well, connecting it all, they summarize how India's sheer power dynamics fundamentally contribute to this neighborly resentment. They state India's $3.9 trillion GDP and massive army scream power, but to smaller neighbors, it's arrogance.
Highlighting that tension, power seen as dominance.
Right, where genuine cooperation can get overshadowed by perceptions of dominance. And furthermore, they critically observe that Prime Minister Modi's strong India talk,
Okay.
citing his statements at the G7 slamming terrorism, for example, reportedly doesn't help when it's seen as dodging accountability for homegrown hate.
Ooh, that's sharp. So projecting strength externally while facing internal criticism.
Yeah.
That doesn't play well with neighbors.
That's the incisive analysis from the sources, synthesizing how India's economic and military might, plus its rhetoric, can be perceived negatively by smaller nations, especially when there are concurrent internal issues getting international criticism.
Wow. So it's this really complex tapestry, isn't it?
Yeah.
Internal challenges, external relations, history, power, all woven together.
Exactly. As laid out by these sources, it offers some stark warnings, but also maybe some surprising glimmers of hope. Which brings us to the end. What does this all mean for us? What can we take away from this deep dive?
Right. What we've unpacked today, really drawing from the detailed accounts in these materials, it's a profound, complex portrayal of India, facing significant internal pressures, external pressures. The claims range from alleged systematic marginalization of a huge minority to pervasive challenges in civic behavior and these really strained regional relations. It's clear these sources present a very strong, consistent argument for why some observers think India is at a critical point, navigating a path that will really define its future.
And the sources highlight, don't they, that this isn't presented as just India's problem.
No, exactly. But in their framing, it's a warning for diverse societies everywhere about the potential erosion of diversity, of democratic principles, when communal tensions are allegedly exploited or just allowed to fester.
And amidst these stark warnings, these complex narratives, the sources do provide both stories of profound challenge and, well, inspiring resilience, giving us a more complete human picture.
Yeah, they do. Remind us of the challenge story.
Well, to capture the deeply personal nature of it, they recount that powerful story of the 9-year-old Muslim kid in Agra.
Right.
Tragically called a Pakistani terrorist by classmates. His mom had to pull him out of school because of the alleged harassment.
Just heartbreaking.
The sources describe it not just as a headline, but a heartbreak. underscoring that deeply personal, painful impact of the alleged hatred on individuals, on families.
But then to counterbalance that, there's a story of resilience.
Yes, a compelling one. Hiba Sheikh, a 19-year-old Muslim girl facing down harassers to become a cop.
Wow, that takes courage.
Immense courage. This act of individual determination is called the spirit we need, encapsulating that enduring strength, individual agency, found even in these incredibly tough circumstances, suggesting hope and resistance persist despite it all.
So the sources suggest some paths forward from this complex, sometimes alarming situation.
They do towards the end. Things like stop swallowing the hate, dig into the truth, talk to someone who doesn't look like you.
Simple actions, but maybe powerful.
And it ultimately frames India's enduring strength as its fundamental diversity, which, the sources claim, is crumbling under Modi's BJP and their blind followers.
Providing a strong concluding thought from the sources themselves, identifying the core value they see at risk and the forces they believe are threatening it.
So knowing all this, considering these detailed accounts laid out in the materials we've discussed, it leaves us with some big questions, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Like, what do you think is the precise role of information, and maybe more critically, misinformation in shaping public opinion, social cohesion, especially in any diverse society?
Yeah, that's huge. And what about individual actions?
How can individual acts of courage, like Hiba Sheikh's story, contribute to larger systemic change? Or do these deep-seated issues need totally different, more institutional approaches?
Or maybe both.
Perhaps. And finally, what responsibility do we, as informed global citizens, have when we're faced with such stark, contrasting narratives about a nation as vast and influential as India?
Those are some really provocative thoughts to end on. Definitely things to mull over.
Absolutely.
We really hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a richer, more nuanced, and thoroughly explored understanding of the complexities being discussed in these materials. Keep that curiosity burning and keep asking the big questions.